Over Wire.
Oh, here he comes! Hey. Minister!
Minister, how are you? Minister, answer. Well, how's your wife?
Answer the question, Minister!
Counterclockwise, thanks to scoop.co.nz.
All right, it's time to go over to Selwyn Manning. Selwyn, it's been ages since I spoke to you last. How are you?
It almost seems like a whole summer, doesn't it, John?
Almost. What, summer? Is that what it was called? Summer was on a Wednesday this year, I thought, but...
Oh, I know. I was talking to some, one of the radio stations in South Australia yesterday, and they were kind of saying, they've had a bit of bad weather too, but it's been sitting around the 30 degrees, and they had blue skies most of the time. And I says, oh, well, when I told them our situation up here in Auckland, they kind of absolutely commiserate. You know?
What a shame for them, eh? A bad summer of 30 degrees. Poor things. So this week we're talking about New Zealand on air and political documentaries ahead of elections. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right, John. Yeah, and I thought we'd put it into a little bit of a context. You know, obviously the hard news has been well addressed on this. Tom Fruin kicked it off. Tom Fruin, for many who listen to public broadcasting on Radio New Zealand across there, would recognise his voice and his work from his Today in Parliament work. And in recent years, his work has been funded by New Zealand on air in part, and has been distributed and syndicated right across the board and featured prominently on Scoop as well for the last couple of years. Now, Tom Fruin's work, he did an OIA, or an Official Information Act request, and he kind of got access to this exchange of emails in New Zealand on air that underline or sit underneath all the reports on this New Zealand on air issue that we've heard in the last couple of days, John. So from there, I think what we need to do in such things is to try and see whether or not an issue like this is in isolation, or whether or not it is part of a trend. And if it is, a part of a trend, how do we define that, and how do we kind of figure out what's going to be taking place in the future should a government, the national-led government, continue on a particular bent? So let's kind of look at this and put it into a context. Some are arguing, and I think accurately, that it is a move to try and influence or shut down part of public broadcasting, or the independence of public broadcasting. Yeah. So who's trying to do that? Well, it does connect to the national-led government, but more importantly, not just the government apparatus of this, but the actual party political aspect of it, which, just because the National Party is in government, doesn't give it the right to kind of orchestrate a firm hand over every kind of area of the media spectrum, if you like, that is going to provide some sort of critical analysis. And that, to me, is one of the most concerning things.
Just to interrupt you, because we had correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there, because it's not, I don't think it is just down to national on this one. I'm not a national supporter, that's quite clear to you and anyone who listens to the show regularly, but wasn't there a situation some time ago where Helen Clark tried to put the dampeners on satire? Political-based satire. It's not just maybe the sort of headspace of leaders that they think that they're untouchable.
Yeah, no, exactly. And we need to look at this. There's a couple of differences. One being that Helen Clark was trying to do that through a legislation or a regulation kind of route, and she was the Prime Minister and trying to do this. We haven't seen John Key publicly trying to actually shut down or criticise the approach that the news media have taken on any given issue. What we have, I'm talking about the New Zealand on the air kind of thing, if we just focus on that. But what we have seen is the National Party appoint a political colleague, if you like. I mean, he's John Key's electorate chairman, for goodness sake. He's the National Party's, he's very significant in the National Party in the northern region of the National Party. Now, this man was appointed by the Cabinet to New Zealand on air, and that's a political appointment, but it's a government appointment, but it's also a political appointment. So we need to kind of look at it in that way. Yes, Labor, when it was in office, it did the appointments itself. Oh, we've got a train going past, probably just about blast everybody's eardrums off. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that if Labor put appointments into public broadcasting, if we keep it defined to this, in the same way that National has, it would have been hauled over the coals in the same way that the National Party is at the moment. Yeah. Unfortunately for everybody in this debate, the National Party is silent. You won't hear John Key, the Prime Minister, speak on this unless he was absolutely pushed to when they're all back sitting in Parliament at the end of February. But, let's get back to it in the context, in a sense. I think, that this is an issue of independence relating to the public broadcasting funder. New Zealand On Air traditionally has been criticised for being a bunch of cronies who look after those well-heeled people that have been well exposed to mainstream media and give squat little attention to anyone else on the independent kind of fringe, if you like. And that has been well and truly, in amongst the details of criticism. If you look at it from this point of view, this is even worse in a sense, because it's not necessarily, the old club looking after the old club. This is actually a political appointment that is high up in a political party that happens to be in government at the moment, that is absolutely arguing that New Zealand On Air should not fund a piece of work that is independently created to analyse and critically assess a very, very high interest issue of child poverty in New Zealand, and to explore what impact failed government policy has had on creating that, and also to explore what solutions are in evidence that could make this problem better for the lot of those who are trapped in this. We're talking about child poverty here.
It's crucial that this is brought up, especially at the time of an election, I would have thought.
Yeah. Now, just before we do another comparison, the problem here in the email, in my view, was not one where, the National Party started to engage on whether or not it believed the solutions were correct or not, or whether or not the analysis on the party policy was correct or not. It actually sent its person in to criticise via email New Zealand On Air funding, this kind of thing, that what he referred to as political satire. Now, if we look at it into this broader context, I think there's political interference here. I think, a reasonably minded person in evaluating those aspects we've just discussed would come to a conclusion, in my view, that there's been political interference, and particularly if you read the emails that Tom Fruin's article on Scoop has referred to. Now, if we look at public broadcasting across the board, in the mid and latter stages of the Labour-led government, we saw efforts to segregate out, if you like, free-to-air TVNZ7, on Television New Zealand, where it's free of ads, it's promos on there, but free of ads and things like that, and to see it, for a predetermined time to see whether or not it worked. Now, we've seen the national government obviously indicate that by mid-year this year, it's going to cut the cable on that, and the word around the traps is that it's going to be made into some sort of advertorial type of channel, So that's another thing that we have to look at it in the context. The public broadcasting aspects of TVNZ has been, is being cut. The other thing is TVNZ itself. The charter has been pulled. If we look at also New Zealand On Air's funding for the independent radio station Stratos TV, was on the Freeview network, and doing a lot of critical analysis of political policy, etc., etc., and had grown in its audience up to 1 million viewers a month, which is obviously an impressive number of people. It was not able to get New Zealand On Air funding at all for those programs that presented on Stratos itself. It could only get those New Zealand On Air funding for the programs on Triangle, which would only go to the Auckland audience. And it's on analogue, so after 2 years' time, the cable will be cut, that will be gone. So, that's another aspect of it. So we're starting to get a bit of a picture, in my mind, and it'd be interesting to see if your listeners text in and say, "Well, the guys are loony" or something like that. But in my mind, there's a pattern to this. There's a context to it, and it's one of concern, and it's one that needs to be challenged, in my view. I mean, imagine if the government, the political apparatus of the government, just had its access to a channel where it just put out its press statement, read, like in some sort of Fiji type situation. Would the New Zealand public put up with that? Because that's basically what this party that's in government seems to want, John. I think it wants no critical analysis. It just wants the top spin put on things and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Do you know what troubles me about it? And I think I've mentioned this to you before ahead of the election, but, well, I'll come to that. But to boil it all down, for me, this seems like the powers that be, if you like, they object to this issue of influence ahead of an election that might influence people negatively against them. But to me, and I've said this before, you have electoral polls, which to me they're much more influential because they seem to go on for a long time. And in France, I don't think that you're allowed to have polls. I don't understand this sort of, well, you can't have influence that way, but you can have it this way because this way is more subtle. It just seems like a double standard. And maybe I've took off on a bit of a tangent there.
No, not at all. I think it's an interesting point, and I hadn't actually thought of it in that context. I think with respect to with the New Zealand and their funding for this particular documentary on child poverty, there wouldn't be a better time for a debate on that issue than during an election campaign. Yeah. It's a valid piece of work.
Absolutely.
And it's essential to the public interest that we have robust debate on this. When we say critical analysis too, what I'm talking about there is not just an argumentative kind of nitpicking kind of exercise. It is basically to look at a particular issue and to analyse that from the point of view of what is going wrong here and what are the solutions to make it better. If we only and to give fairness to the issue and to give attention to where things are going right. And that documentary pretty much, I thought, fitted all of those types of issues. For a critique to, and a complaint to go from one of its politically appointed board members of New Zealand On Air to the chair of the New Zealand On Air that is saying that it's political satire, I think it's an insult not just to the program carrier, which is TV3, or the creator of that piece of work, but also to the public of New Zealand. It was an attempt to try and ensure that in the future, when there are politically sensitive periods of time, and that might not necessarily just be during an election campaign, then the government can expect not to be criticised by the Fourth Estate through a public-funded kind of body like that.
It's what do you think is going to happen? I mean, we've only got like a couple more minutes left, but what do you suppose is going to happen now with the guy that's the centre of all this? What do you suppose is going to happen to that guy now? Is he going to keep his place on the board? I mean, is it untenable? I mean, how...
it's a hard one to kind of really predict in a sense. If all we can do is look at the pattern going back, say, over the last 12 months. We saw an impressive piece of investigative journalism by John Stevenson on Afghanistan and New Zealand SAS soldiers up there, and this issue of handing those that are apprehended over to other forces that may or may not have tortured them. Now, the Prime Minister's response to serious questions on trying to figure out whether or not New Zealand had breached international human rights laws in respect to this was one where he laughed and ridiculed the journalist John Stevenson. So it went no further at that political level. Even the Labour Party refused to push for an independent inquiry in the first stages of that becoming public knowledge. We saw the same with Nikki Hager's book. Irrespective of if someone thinks the people are politically motivated, that's got nothing to do with it. The facts that are presented in a body of work speak for themselves.
That's right.
But he was ridiculed. There's a pattern of shut down, laugh it off, and continue on. Where there will be a consequence, I do think, John, is I think the Fourth Estate has been kicked in the guts by the Prime Minister during the election campaign of sicking the cops onto anyone that was going to look like they were going to produce a transcript of that Tea Party fiasco. The Fourth Estate has had another look inside and under the lid, thanks to Tom Fruin's hard work, that the National Party is starting to push its weight and trying to actually orchestrate some sort of party dominance over the Fourth Estate's funding mechanisms. I think if anything's going to come from this, we have to look at it in the context once again, just like we did at the early part of this. And I think that there will be much more analysis and a harder road for the Prime Minister John Key in facing media questions from here on through his, for as long as he wishes to be Prime Minister in this term. That, I think, is what we will see. I don't think you'll see necessarily any kind of sanction given on the individual here that is a party, obviously a favoured party person here.
All right, well, look, Selwyn, I better go because we've got one more feature due before the end of the show. But again, it's been a pleasure to speak to you, and I wish you a happy new year. I've been meaning to say that for a while. And yeah, have a fantastic week, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, and all the best to you and Will and the others at BFM. Have a good year out there. I hope it's a great one.
Awesome. See you later, mate.
Okay, mate. See you.
Bye.
Bye.